In June 1944, just days after D-Day, Allied momentum in Normandy was already at risk. The beaches had been taken, but that was only the beginning. Ahead lay a labyrinth of rivers, swamps, hedgerows, and stone villages that German forces had turned into natural fortresses. Every advance was calculated in meters, not miles. Every crossroads cost blood, and every river threatened to stop entire divisions cold. The Germans believed they had time. They believed they could slow the Americans long enough for reserves to arrive from the Eastern Front. And above all, they believed one thing firmly: American engineers were weak. They mocked them in reports. They claimed U.S. combat engineers lacked initiative, were mechanically slow, and unfit for battlefield construction. To the Wehrmacht, engineering war meant explosives, fortifications, and destruction, not building under fire. They were certain no American engineering unit could construct a bridge under artillery pressure. But what the Germans did not understand was simple. The American army did not move like theirs. It moved on logistics. It moved by bridges. And behind those bridges stood men who were not ordinary soldiers, but builders trained to fight as hard as infantry and work faster than machines. U.S. Army combat engineers. These were the men who carried both TNT and wrenches, carbines and shovels, Bangalore torpedoes and Bailey bridge panels. They were expected to move ahead of tanks, ahead of infantry, ahead of safety. Their mission: clear minefields, breach wire, build roads, lay bridges, and do it under the worst conditions war could create. On June 14, 1944, the 300th Engineer Combat Battalion received orders that seemed simple on paper. Build a bridge across the River near Isigny-sur-Mer to allow the 2nd Armored Division to break through and continue the advance inland. But the Germans had destroyed every bridge in retreat. The riverbanks were flooded by deliberate demolition of locks. The mud was chest-deep from days of rain. The entire crossing was zeroed in by German artillery observers hidden in Norman farmhouses. The Americans who tried to cross would be seen, and when they were seen, they would be shelled. The Germans believed they had created a perfect choke point. They believed steel and explosives could slow America to a crawl. They believed combat engineers would break. They had never seen what American engineers could do when the war tried to stop them. The order came at 4:30. No speeches, no heroics. Just a cold assignment delivered over a field table, soaked with rain. Bridge, or river, 80-foot Bailey, under fire. Tanks must cross by nightfall. The message was clear. Failure was not an option. Delay meant German reinforcements. Delay meant the advance would freeze. Delay meant men would die waiting. The Bailey Bridge was a British invention, portable, modular, fast. Could be carried on trucks, assembled by hand, and built without cranes. It was designed to be put up under combat conditions. But what manuals didn't say was that this required steel discipline, unbreakable coordination, and a team willing to work in hell without stopping. The 300th Engineer Combat Battalion moved before dawn. Trucks rolled forward carrying bridge panels, transoms, stringers, rocking beams, clamps, and jacks. Every man knew his role. There was no improvisation in Bailey construction. One delay, one missing part, one broken panel, and the entire operation failed. The enemy knew it too. German forces from the 352nd Infantry Division were watching the river crossings closely. They had lost ground since D-Day, but they had not lost the fight. They had snipers concealed in barns and hedgerows, 88mm guns pre-sighted on the riverbanks, and artillery batteries ready to fire the moment engineers began building. At 5:10, scouts reported enemy movement beyond the tree line on the far bank. At 5:20, American infantry of the 175th Regiment began to push forward to secure the crossing site. At 5:27, before a single piece of steel touched the river, the first German shells landed. The engineers hit the ground as mud and shrapnel rained over them. The shelling wasn't blind. It was precise. The Germans weren't trying to kill infantry, they were hunting engineers. Every artillery strike targeted assembly points. Every mortar burst landed near stacks of bridge panels. Every sniper searched for men with tools instead of rifles. German doctrine was simple: kill the engineers and the advance dies. But American engineers didn't break. They didn't retreat. They picked up wrenches and rifles at the same time. While infantry engaged German positions, the first bridge components were dragged forward by hand. Steel panels weighing 570 pounds each were hauled through river mud so thick it swallowed boots. Sweat mixed with rain. Commands were shouted through explosions. Every second was paid for. Still they built. And that was the moment the Germans failed to understand what they were facing. These were not support troops. These were frontline soldiers with shovels in one hand and courage in the other. They weren't waiting for safety. They were building through the fire. By 6:15, the engineers had established a crude work zone at the riverbank. There was no natural cover, only wet earth and shattered willow trees. The first step of any Bailey Bridge was the launching nose, a lighter steel skeleton built in front of the main structure to reach the far bank. It had to be assembled first, then pushed out over the river on rollers. That meant the engineers were exposed, standing in the open, working as targets. The Germans saw it immediately. An 88mm gun positioned somewhere beyond the hedgerow opened fire. Its shells hit with terrifying precision. The first round landed short, sending a geyser of mud over the forward team. The second ripped through a truck loaded with bridge parts. It exploded in a violent flash, blowing panels into the air like shrapnel. The third shell tore into the work site and killed 2 engineers instantly. The artillery was adjusting. They were walking the fire closer. Some armies would have waited for the barrage to end. Others would have pulled back and tried again at night. But American doctrine did not allow retreat under fire when a mission was active. The engineers spread out, hugged the ground when the shells hit, then stood back up and kept building. The commander of Company B, Captain William "Bill" Starks, crawled from man to man, shouting orders through grit and smoke. He wasn't giving speeches. He was assigning sections of the bridge under bombardment. Panel team move. Pins and clamps. Forward. Rollers. Get those rollers set now. Keep the line moving. Get that nose built. There were no spare men. Everyone worked. Carpenters. Wiremen. Radio operators. Medics carried the wounded only far enough to stop the bleeding, then came back to lift steel. Every 30 seconds another shell dropped. The ground shook constantly. Men yelled for tools over explosions. And still, the launching nose of the Bailey Bridge began to take shape. At 7:05, a sniper round cracked past a corporal's head as he hammered a panel pin in place. He didn't stop. Another engineer fell into the river after a shell blast threw him backwards. He dragged himself ashore and came back to work drenched and shaking. The Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. American infantry they understood. Armor they respected. Artillery they feared. But these men, these engineers, they didn't fit any logic of war. They were not supposed to fight like this. They were supposed to wait behind the lines. They were supposed to build after the victory. But at the Ore River, under the rain of iron and mud, one fact became clear. The engineers were the victory. By 8 o'clock, the launching nose was complete. Now came the phase that separated real engineers from dead ones. The push. A Bailey Bridge wasn't built across a river section by section. It was built on land, assembled as a growing metal spine, then rolled forward on steel rollers until it stretched over the water. That moment, the launch, was the most vulnerable of all. The engineers had to move nearly 20 tons of steel forward, by hand, while under artillery fire. Tanks couldn't help. Cranes couldn't be used. It had to be muscle, coordination, and willpower. Captain Starks gave the command. Lock it. Brace it. Push. Dozens of men grabbed the bridge. Shoulders bent. Boots dug into mud. The bridge screeched on its rollers as it began to move. Within seconds, the Germans realized what was happening. If that bridge launched, American armor would cross the river, and the German line would break. The order went out across German radio frequencies. Zerstört die Brücke. Destroy the bridge. The sky erupted. Mortars. 88s. Machine guns. Everything the Germans had left opened fire. The first push team took casualties. Men dropped, some screaming, some silent. Others stepped over them and kept pushing. Combat engineers didn't have replacements. They built until they either finished or died. There was no middle ground. When the barrage intensified, one squad ran forward carrying heavy wooden planks. They were not retreating, they were building firing positions. Riflemen from the 175th Infantry dropped into the mud beside the engineers, laying down suppressing fire. The scene turned into a war inside a war. The infantry fighting to hold the line, the engineers fighting to build the future of that line. At 8:27, disaster struck. A German shell hit the left roller station. The impact twisted the frame, jamming the bridge in place. If it couldn't move, the river crossing would fail, and tanks would never get through. The 88s would turn the rest of the bridge into scrap. A lieutenant shouted over the barrage, "Roller station down. We need a bypass." 3 men sprinted forward carrying jacks and anchors. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't ask for covering fire. They threw themselves under the steel frame while it was being shelled and rebuilt the roller station under the bridge, crawling through mud and blood while sparks rained down from impacts. They were exposed. Any shell would kill them instantly. They worked anyway. At 8:49, the lieutenant screamed, "Rollers set! Push!" And the bridge began to move again, inch by inch, panel by panel. With every push, more of the steel skeleton stretched across the River, like a defiance of German firepower in real time. The Germans had been certain. No bridge could survive this. But by 9 o'clock, the Bailey Bridge was halfway across. And it was still going. By 9:30, the bridge extended past the halfway point, reaching over the deepest section of the River. That was exactly what German artillery had been waiting for. Until now, their fire had tried to break the build. Now that the structure was exposed over the water, they shifted tactics. They stopped trying to stop the bridge and started trying to collapse it. A direct hit on any of the main panels would twist the superstructure and send the entire span crashing into the river. Then the engineers would have to start again from zero, something no unit could survive under fire. German observers called in coordinates with deadly precision. Shells began to walk across the length of the bridge. The engineers heard the change instantly. The whistle of the incoming shells was different now, lower, longer. Airburst shrapnel detonated directly over the bridge, tearing into exposed beams like metal rain. Steel rang with impacts. Bolts screamed. A single hit could shear a joint pin loose, and without pins, a Bailey Bridge dies. But the pins held. The clamps held. The frame held. Not because the bridge was invincible, because men were crawling over it mid-barrage, tightening every bolt they could reach. German snipers intensified fire, shifting from infantry targets to bridge crews. One round tore through a corporal's shoulder as he hammered a cord bolt. He didn't stop. He locked the bolt with his other hand. Another engineer was hit in the leg while carrying a transom beam. He fell, 3 others stepped over him and took the beam forward without breaking stride. The clock wasn't measured in minutes anymore, it was measured in lives. Bridge length, 60 feet. Time elapsed, 5 hours. Casualties, 11 killed, 26 wounded. Progress, no retreat. At 10:10, new trouble arrived. German mortars from a hidden position behind a stone farmhouse adjusted onto the riverbank. Their rounds came down behind the engineers, cutting off retreat and pinning the entire work crew in a death pocket. This was no longer engineering. This was survival. Captain Starks made a decision no manual would ever approve. Turn the engineers into a fighting line. Rifles up. Return fire. Combat engineers carried more than tools. They carried M1 carbines, bars, and sometimes even .30 cal Browning machine guns mounted on tripods for exactly this moment. Within seconds, the river crossing became a two-front battle. One group returned fire at the farmhouse, while another continued the bridge launch. It wasn't clean. It wasn't by the book. But it worked. Then, something unexpected happened. For the first time in the battle, the Germans stopped firing. Not because they were defeated, but because they were confused. Engineers weren't supposed to fight. They weren't supposed to charge into machine gun fire. They weren't supposed to keep building after taking casualties. And they definitely weren't supposed to hold a frontline position while constructing a 20-ton bridge by hand. But they did. And at 10:45, under black smoke and broken earth, the Bailey Bridge reached the far bank. It was not over. It was only about to get worse. Reaching the far bank didn't mean victory. It meant the most dangerous phase had begun. The bridge was touching the enemy side now. The Germans would not allow it to be anchored. If the far bank wasn't secured, the entire structure could be pushed into the river with explosives, grenades, or even a simple demolition charge at the abutment. The engineers had extended the bridge under fire. Now they had to hold it in enemy territory. At 11 o'clock, a German counterattack hit the crossing. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, veterans of coastal defense, launched a fast assault from the hedgerows. They weren't coming to reclaim ground. They were coming to destroy the bridge at any cost. If they reached the abutment, the battle would be over in seconds. American infantry moved to intercept, but they were still arriving in fragments from Isigny. That left the men already on site, the engineers themselves, as the only defense on the far riverbank. They didn't hesitate. Sergeant Frank O'Malley led the first fire team across the unfinished bridge with a coil of detonation cord over his shoulder and a .30 carbine in his hands. He wasn't supposed to assault anything. He was a bridge builder, not an infantryman, but in Normandy, combat engineers lived by a simple rule. If something needs doing, do it. Rank and job description mean nothing here. They reached the far bank and threw themselves behind a half-collapsed stone wall. Seconds later, the Germans charged through the hedgerow. Grenades first, rifles second. The firefight was brutal and close. 20 yards, then 10, then 5. An engineer firing from the hip with a bar cut down 2 grenadiers before being killed by return fire. Another engineer took over his weapon immediately, no pause, no reaction. They were running out of ammo and time, and the bridge still wasn't secured. The engineers were not trained for prolonged infantry combat, but they fought with one advantage the Germans didn't expect. They refused to break. Down on the riverbank, more engineers crawled over the steel frame, hammering the last bearing plates into place while bullets snapped overhead. Others pushed cribbing timbers into the mud to reinforce the bridgehead. It wasn't enough. They needed more manpower on the far bank to clear the Germans, but they also needed more manpower to finish anchoring the bridge. Captain Starks gave the order that would decide the battle. Split the company. Half fight, half build. Nobody stops. It shouldn't have worked. It shouldn't have even been possible. But at 11:26, the tide turned. A column of M4 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armored Division Hell on Wheels arrived at the crossing. Their commanders saw the unfinished bridge and did not wait for clearance. A tank commander stood up in his turret and shouted toward the engineers, "Is that bridge ready?" A voice came back through the smoke. "It's ready enough. Get across." The first Sherman lurched forward, its treads grinding steel as it rolled over the untested bridge. The entire structure flexed under 33 tons of armored weight. Every engineer held his breath. The bridge held. The tank roared across, reached the far bank, and fired point-blank into the German assault force. The explosion shattered the farmhouse and broke the grenadier line instantly. Within minutes, the counterattack collapsed. The far bank was secured. But the battle to keep the bridge alive had only begun. By 12:15, Shermans were crossing the bridge one by one, but every crossing risked collapse. The Bailey Bridge was designed to carry tanks, but only if it was fully reinforced. This one wasn't. It was still missing bracing posts, sway frames, transoms, decking panels, and crucial locking pins. It was a skeleton, alive but fragile. One bad crossing could twist the entire frame into the river. But they had no choice. The 2nd Armored Division needed to break through before the Germans could regroup. That meant tanks had to move now, even if the bridge wasn't finished. The engineers worked beneath the tanks as they crossed. It was madness. Every time a 33-ton Sherman rolled forward, the entire bridge moaned from the strain. Steel groaned. Rivets creaked. The decking buckled. The bridge wasn't ready for armor, but it took armor anyway because men were underneath it, holding it together in real time. One team crawled along the lower cords with hammers, tightening connection pins. Another drove pickets into the riverbed to stabilize sway. Others dragged in timber to build cribbing supports. They were building while tanks passed over their heads. The riverbank shook with every crossing. Mud rained down. Steel shivered above them. They didn't stop. At 12:40, a German Nebelwerfer battery found the range. The first rockets screamed overhead and detonated behind the American line, sending shockwaves through the crossing. The second salvo hit closer. The third came down directly on the bridge approach. The explosions threw men off their feet. The shock snapped several braces loose and blew 2 decking panels into the river. One engineer was killed instantly. Another was thrown against a steel beam and knocked unconscious. When he came to, he didn't ask for a medic. He asked for his wrench. Artillery fire returned. Snipers reappeared. German machine guns from the far hedgerow reopened. The crossing was becoming a death trap. But now something had changed. The engineers no longer waited for infantry to protect them. They protected the bridge. It had become more than steel and pins. It was the only road forward. They defended it like it was a living soldier. And in a way it was. At 13:05, a German 88mm round landed near the central span and cracked a main panel. If that panel failed, the entire bridge would shear and collapse. There were no spare panels. They couldn't replace it. They could only reinforce it. 2 engineers sprinted into the blast zone carrying a cross girder. No cover, no protection. They locked the girder into place while the panel was splitting, holding the frame together long enough for 2 more tanks to cross. 5 minutes later, one of them collapsed. He died with a wrench still in his hand. By 1400 hours, the bridge had been holding for nearly 9 hours. 9 hours of constant artillery. 9 hours of sniper fire. 9 hours of German counterattacks and Luftwaffe strafing runs. Each hour should have been their last. Instead, each hour pushed the German line closer to collapse. But a new problem emerged: the river itself. The Our River had risen higher than expected from the previous night storm. The water level climbed inch by inch, pushing against the bridge supports. The engineers hadn't had time to anchor the far bank with full abutments. If the water gained more height, the entire superstructure could shift sideways and fold under tank weight. Captain Starks knew it. The company knew it. But there was no time to stop. No time to reset. They had to hold the bridge until a second support could be built. Which meant only one thing. They needed a pier. In the river. Under fire. Immediately. It should have been impossible. Sergeant O'Malley led the crew. They cut timber, dragged sandbags, carried stone, and built cribs in the freezing water. They waded in waist-deep, while German machine guns chewed up the water around them. They stacked lumber and rock with hands that were shaking from exhaustion. Their uniforms were soaked. Their arms were covered in bruises and cuts from broken lumber. Blood and mud mixed in the river. And they kept working. On the bank, enemy artillery found them again. Shells slammed into the mud. One explosion tore a man apart and sent his body into the current. 2 engineers grabbed him. Not because he could be saved, but because they wouldn't allow the river to take him. They laid him on the ground, closed his eyes, and went back into the water. By 1445, the first pier was in place, a crude but powerful support under the midspan. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't according to regulation, but it gave the bridge a second spine, and that spine kept it alive. Then came the hardest decision of the day. Lieutenant Harper ordered a test. A tank would cross at full speed. If the bridge survived the shock, reinforcements could pour through for a full offensive. If it failed, it would kill everyone on it and collapse into the river. The Sherman began its run. By 1600 hours, the Bailey Bridge over the Our River was carrying a full flow of war. Shermans, half-tracks, ammo trucks, field guns. Everything that made an army move thundered across steel that had been built by hand under fire. Every vehicle that crossed was a message to the Germans. You failed to stop us. But the battle was not over. German forces launched a final counterattack. Not at the bridge, but beyond it. They knew they could no longer destroy the crossing, so they tried to bottle up the Americans on the far bank and trap them before more armor could arrive. If they could force the engineers back across the river, the crossing would become a death box instead of a breakthrough. The attack hit at 1620. Elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, reinforced by remnants of the 30th Mobile Brigade, struck from the northeast. They brought with them mortars, MG-42s, and Panzerfaust teams. Their goal wasn't to win, they were going to die there, and they knew it. Their goal was delay. In war, Time can be a weapon deadlier than steel. The engineers were exhausted. Many had been awake for 30 hours. Their hands were blistered raw. Their uniforms were soaked and stiff with mud and dried blood. But they didn't withdraw. They didn't ask for relief. They formed a defensive line, engineers on the left, infantry on the right, Shermans in the center, and they held. They fought like they built. Without fear, without pause, without excuses. German artillery rained down. Men dropped. The line bent, but it did not break. Behind them, the bridge thundered with more tanks crossing. The 2nd Armored Division was now arriving in strength. And when American armor arrives in strength, it does not stop. At 17:05, Lieutenant Harper stood on the bridge and watched as the 41st Armored Infantry Battalion rolled across behind the Shermans. He didn't need orders to know what it meant. The battle had been decided. The engineers, those men the Germans had mocked in their reports, those labor units the Wehrmacht dismissed as soft, slow, and weak, had opened a road where no road existed. And they had done it under constant fire in less than half a day. By 1740, the German counterattack collapsed completely. Survivors withdrew into the hedgerows. Some surrendered. Some vanished into the darkening fields. Others died trying to hold ground that no longer mattered. Because now the Americans had a bridge. And once America has a bridge, it has momentum. By dusk, the battlefield was quiet except for the rumble of engines crossing the bridge. What began as a muddy river and a German choke point had become a steel artery feeding an entire American advance. The 2nd Armored Division poured through, followed by artillery, fuel trucks, bulldozers, and more engineer units who would widen the road and push deeper inland. The breakout had begun. But the story of the bridge did not end with the last Sherman. When the gunfire faded and the smoke drifted away, the engineers stayed. They didn't celebrate. They didn't raise flags or pose for photographs. They walked back over what they had built and picked up the bodies of their dead. 23 engineers had fallen that day. More than 40 were wounded. Some had died carrying steel. Others had died holding rifles. A few died without anyone seeing how, but their work remained standing behind them, stronger than the river, stronger than the artillery that tried to break it. A correspondent who reached the site that evening asked Captain Starks how his men had kept working under fire, how they had built a bridge in 10 hours while being targeted again and again, how they didn't stop. He didn't give a speech. He didn't talk about heroism. He didn't mention courage or sacrifice or history. He just said, "We had a job, so we did it." Years later, German officers would admit in post-war interviews that they had underestimated one thing more than any other: American engineers. They expected them to be builders. They never expected them to be fighters. They thought they could stop them with artillery. They didn't understand that engineers didn't need safety to build. They only needed a mission. On that day, on a muddy river in Normandy, they proved something simple. Infantry wins ground. Armor wins firepower. But engineers win wars. The Germans laughed until they watched a bridge rise under fire.